Well, g'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm reviewing the Canon RF100-300 2.8. What an incredible lens. I'm going to be answering all the common questions. How does it go with the 2x converter? What about the 1.4 converter? How does it compare to the 100-500, the Sony 200-600? How's the AF? How's the IS? How's the image quality? I'm going to answer all of this and more. I'm going to share loads of photos. I'm going to share my personal experiences in the field after taking over 10,000 images. I've had it for a number of days. I'm excited to share it with you. So this review is broken down into chapters. You can see them at the bottom of this video or have a look in the description if you want to look at something specific. For full disclosure, Canon CPS actually sent me this lens and the Canon R3 to try for a number of days, and then I'm going to be returning it. They have no say over my thoughts. They haven't reviewed this video. They didn't give me any money. It's all my opinion. I'm just very grateful that they sent me this gear to try. Now I need to preface this review by making it clear that this lens is not a dedicated wildlife lens. It's basically a 70-200 2.8 on steroids. It's made for sports. It's made for that really low light shooting for high shutter speeds. However, I am a wildlife photographer, so I'm going to be reviewing it for wildlife. We just need to be aware it's not really fair to compare it to the dedicated 600 and 500mm primes. But we'll have a look anyway. Alrighty, so let's have a chat about the actual lens itself. It's actually a 100-300mm zoom lens, which we can change by turning this zoom ring. And it has a max aperture of f2.8, which is extremely fast. Now this is a brand new design for Canon's RF mirrorless mount. It replaces the fantastic EF300 2.8 version 2 for DSLRs. Now that lens was super sharp. I had a lot of fun with it. I took wonderful portraits, including this amazing portrait of a penguin. So I have extremely high hopes that this lens will be as sharp as that one. Now in terms of its weight and size, check it out. It's a monster. It's actually really, really big. I was a little bit surprised, to be honest, that it's heavier than the 300 2.8. This one here, working weight with the lens hood, I think is around 2.8 kilos or 6.19 pounds. You whack on this big R3, which is about a kilo, you're looking at close to 4 kilos working weight handheld, which, you know, is quite heavy. Admittedly, the lens does feel quite nice in the hand, and I shot handheld nearly the majority of the time. Yes, my arms got a bit tired, but you can definitely handhold. Of course, depending on your build and your stature, but over long periods, you may need to use a monopod or a tripod. When we start comparing it to other lenses, this here is the 100-500. So fully extended, this is the difference. This here is about half the weight of this one. And we can see that when we put them side by side, this one's just a lot smaller than this one. The Sony is lighter than this one. It's heavier than the 100-500, so it sort of sits in the middle. This is internally focusing as well. This is the Sony, and if we put them side by side, they are fairly similar. The Sony is definitely a touch lighter, but in terms of actual length, obviously the lens hood's bigger on the Sony than this one, so the Canon is just slightly longer. Now the other thing to consider is if we use a 2x converter, which most wildlife shooters would be, it's going to add quite a bit of extra length and weight. I think once we attach this, we're actually cracking over that 3 kilo mark, which makes it twice the weight of the 100-500 and 600 grams heavier than the Sony, and it's even heavier than the Nikon 800 6.3. So just food for thought in terms of the weight. You can see in this comparison, here's the 4 lenses side by side. We've got the 100-500, the Sony 200-600, the 100-300, and of course my big 500mm prime. That gives you some idea of just how big this lens is. Now, being an RF lens, it does inherit all the amazing lens features that Canon has in RF, that being the control ring at the front of the lens, which is nice for exposure compensation. It's got the addition of these lens function buttons at the front. I haven't really found a use for these yet, but I'm sure many of you have. The actual build quality is fantastic. It's got proper good weather sealing in there to keep out the dirt, and it's up to that high level as you would expect. Now, there's one feature I absolutely love on this lens. I'm so happy to see it, and I hope all Canon lenses in the future will have this. At the top of the lens, you will see that it says LFN, preset, and recall. You might be going, well, what is that? Well, what that is it enables us to save a set focus distance and then recall to that. So let me explain. So with mirrorless bodies, what often happens is we're shooting and then the camera locks onto the background and we can't get it to come back to the subject. And what are we going to do? Well, what we generally do is turn the manual focus override to pull the focus back, or we focus at the ground and come back up. What we can do now with this lens is if we set it to preset, I focus on the perch or the subject or a set distance, there's now a button on the side of the lens right here. And this here is our focus preset button. So I basically push this to set the distance of where I want the lens and camera to remember. I then come back to the top switch and I go to recall. Now when I'm shooting, if at any point I want to come back to that saved distance, I simply just hit this button and it immediately pulls focus back to that saved location. And this is fantastic. And I did this in the field. So you can see this in action here. I've set it to preset. I've focused on Gary the Galah, so that's the distance I want to remember. I hold down the button on the side of the lens. It now remembers that distance, switch it over to recall. And now when I'm shooting it, if any point I lose focus, I simply just hit the button and it pulls it straight back. And you can see it in action here. We're on the background, we're out of focus. Simply push the button, boom, instantly back to the subject. And that is just fantastic. Now this lens did have it, your big primes do have it, but it works differently. You have a ring on it that you've got to turn. Having this button on the side means I can shoot and just one finger. I don't have to take my hand off the camera and I don't have to use my left hand. This is supporting the lens. So that is ideal. Now this is an internal zoom, so we turn it and there's no barrel that comes out. In terms of the throw, that is how quickly it goes from 100 to 300. So I'm currently at 100. So if I'm shooting, it's 2 turns. Can you hear that? That's one thing I noticed straight away when I started turning it was this loud noise, and I'll put it up to the microphone. It almost sounds like it's broken, but that's clearly just the design feature. It just makes that noise. And when we go to, say, the Sony, which is also an internal zoom, I'll just see how this sounds. It's almost silent. There's definitely a difference. And in terms of the zoom, the Sony's got a much shorter throw, so I can go from 600 to 200 just with that one turn. I think that just depends on your preference. Some people like a short throw, some people like a long throw. I kind of prefer a shorter throw because I want to quickly go from 200 to 600 or 100 to 300 or whatever it is. But again, that's personal preference. Now I did try and record the elements moving inside the lens, and I'll show you this is what it looks like. So when we do turn from 100 to 300, you can see all the elements moving inside the lens, which is probably contributing to that noise. And now you've probably noticed that I've got this Arca Swiss bolted onto it. It's just such an annoyance. I'm not sure why these manufacturers continue to give us lens foot without Arca Swiss built in. Some have already changed over, but I would love a built-in foot with Arca Swiss. It just makes sense. When we talk about the price, it's kind of eye-watering. This retails in the US for $9,500 US, so it's definitely up there in terms of price. In the Australian market, due to the exchange rate, believe it or not, this currently retails for 17,000 Australian dollars, which is a lot of money. And clearly that price puts it out of reach for the majority of shooters. Only really the pros and those with the means are going to be able to afford to buy this lens. What's interesting is Canon seem to be putting a premium on their RF-L lenses. This, as I mentioned, is $9,500. The EF 2.8, the prime lens it replaces, currently retails, I think, in the US for $6,000. So this is $3,500 more expensive than its predecessor. And of course, we do get that extra zoom range. So that's understandable, but it is expensive. If we compare it to the Nikon 120-300, which is for their DSLRs, that's the exact same price. Another interesting change that they've made is the lens hood is just way smaller than the previous lens hood. So you can see it's just almost half the size of the big 500 f4, and it's even smaller than that Sony. So it's definitely to reduce the overall length. They've obviously gone for a smaller hood. And the other big change is they've gone away from the drop-in filters and they've actually got a lens cap. It's a massive lens cap because I think the filter thread is 112mm. So if you're going to use a filter, such as a polarizer filter or a variable density filter, it's going to cost quite a lot because it's a huge filter. I don't personally use filters myself, so it's not a major issue, but just something you need to be aware of. So the big question, is it worth $9,500 US? And it depends. It depends on your finances and it depends on your style of shooting. For a sports shooter, it probably makes a lot of sense. If you use a 70-200 2.8 and a 300 or 400mm prime, you can kind of do away with that, get this one lens and it can do everything. You've got 100 to 300 2.8. However, this isn't a sports channel, this is a wildlife channel. And with wildlife, we tend to need more than 300mm. You can definitely get nice shots with 300, especially if you can get close. In Australia, our large mammals are of course kangaroos, and I did have a bit of success with kangaroos. Here's a shot. Probably don't need to guess which one's the male, but we can get reasonably close to kangaroos here, especially in those built up areas, and 300mm was more than enough to enable me to capture that shot. However, as soon as I started encountering little birds in the bush like this brown-headed honeyeater, you can see the bird's quite small. I just couldn't get any closer. However, we're often shooting beyond 300mm, and it becomes a much harder sell, to be honest, and we're probably better off just getting a longer focal length. Alrighty, so many of you are probably saying, well, Duade, this takes converters. And it does, and that's one of the major benefits of this internal zoom. It takes the converters without any issue whatsoever. The 70-200, for example, will not take converters. The 100-500, we lose that 100-300mm range, and it's very annoying. But on this, we can use the 1.4 and the 2x converters, which I have both of them here. Of course, this adds extra cost. I think these are maybe $500 or $600 US each, so that's going to increase your cost significantly. In Australia, they're about $1,000 each, so it's just something to be aware of. The big question is, how does that impact the focal length and how does that impact the quality? Well, Canon have created this interesting chart which demonstrates the different sizes that you're able to get. In its native form, we've obviously got 100-300 2.8. We add a 1.4 converter. We now go to 140-420mm. We lose a stop of light, so we go to f4. And then if we use the 2x converter, we obviously go to 200-600 5.6. So you get a range of 100-600. Of course, you've got to swap the extenders. And if you use an APS-C body, which has that 1.6 crop factor, our focal length doesn't change, of course. However, our field of view does change. And you can see along the bottom there how that changes. In theory, on the R7, we have up to 960mm field of view, or full frame equivalent, which is quite a lot of reach and is very useful if you have an APS-C body. Let's take a quick look at how this focal length impacts the size of the subject. So we start at 100mm, which is our widest field of view. The subject's quite small. We can see the background. Great for habitats, landscapes, and things like that. We then zoom to 200mm, and we've definitely got a much narrower depth of field now. The subject's bigger, and our background starts to lose focus. And when we go to 300 2.8, this is when you can really see the depth of field at play. That 2.8, our background is starting to dissolve. The bird is now much bigger. Next, we put on the 1.4 converter. We go to 420mm at f4. And again, the subject's bigger. The background's now more out of focus. This is probably a good birding focal length. This is where I would start and go beyond this. And then if we use the 2x converter, we can obviously go all the way to 500mm, which is a bit more than 420. And then finally, we get to 600. So 600mm, the subject is definitely large, our background's definitely out of focus, and it just looks fantastic. Now if we compare 100 to 600, there's an enormous difference, and that range is incredible. Of course, we have to change extenders, and that probably is a real big weakness, to be honest. I hate changing extenders in the field, and I suspect I would generally have the 2x on the majority of the time, which negates the purpose of this lens altogether because you lose that 2.8. However, if you've been watching Canon rumors and you're aware of what's going on, Canon are about to release one converter that rules them all. We're going to have one converter that has 1x, 1.4 and 2x. So you're going to be able to put this new converter in between your camera and your lens, and there'll be some sort of switch where you can go from 100 to 300, 2.8, flick a switch, you can go to either 1.4 or 2x, and that will revolutionize how this lens works in the field. And I'm very excited. Having the ability to go from 600 5.6 to 300 2.8 at the flick of a switch will just be amazing. It effectively makes it a 100 to 600 focal length, which is great. And that new extender is the reason why this doesn't have a built-in 1.4. At present though, we have to use these extenders, and as I'll show you, there are quite a few weaknesses in regards to these extenders. All right, so now that leads me to the image quality and the images that I was able to take with this lens and the various combinations. Let's start with the first combination, and that's how you should use this lens as a 2.8 300. So I went out into the field, I used the R3 and the R5 predominantly just to see how it would operate and tried my luck with 300mm. It's obviously a bit of a challenge because it's a bit short, but I was interested to see what sort of shots I was able to get. The first image I want to share is possibly one of my favorite ones, and it just happened by chance. I took the lens with me. I take a morning walk every morning, and on my way I was coming down my driveway. I wasn't far from my house, and I flushed a common bronzewing, and the bronzewing flew up into a tree. Now it was obstructed. I couldn't get a good shot where it was, so I quietly and slowly moved my way around to try and improve my position. And so I'm hand holding 300 2.8, I'm getting there, and then I can see an opening in the foliage. There's like this one opening, bush either side. Obviously lifted the camera up to my eye, focused on the subject, rattled away. The bird was in the sunlight, the background was dappled, and we captured this shot, which I absolutely love. And just goes to show how important the light is in creating drama, creating uniqueness. And overall, I was just super happy. And it's sharp, it's super sharp, as you would expect from that 300 2.8. The next opportunity I had was I went to the Winton wetlands, and I happened to run into some of my members. So shout out Alan and everyone else. It was lovely to catch up. And so I had to challenge myself to try and get creative and take wider shots. There were a few whistling kites flying around the wetlands. Instead of trying to get the bird big in the sky, which was going to be a struggle, I decided to zoom out a little bit and try and capture the bird as it flew over the reeds. And that's exactly what happened. Here's the shot. We can see the reeds, the trees, the bird, just creating that nice environment type situation that you can do with those wider focal lengths. And I think it was actually taken at 233mm, which is pretty wide for a bird in flight. I then jumped in my truck and I was driving around, and there happened to be a kangaroo next to the road. So I've literally just photographed out the window. Someone did ask, what's it like for run and gun? I just left the camera seatbelt. I gave it put a seatbelt on it just in case, next to the passengers on the passenger seat. Whenever I needed, I just picked it up, sort of out the window at this kangaroo. We've got this beautiful portrait. The detail again is amazing at 2.8. We can see all the hair detail on the kangaroo, and we had quite a bit of fun. Now, as the clouds rolled in and we didn't really have any light, I started to hear some cockatoos fighting, and there's a lot of cockatoos at the wetlands. And I decided to try and get creative, and I've actually walked my way sort of backlight. So the sun was over here, the birds were here, and they were just play fighting with each other. So I've positioned myself, obviously hand holding again, and I've just positioned it and just waited for some sort of action, holding down the autofocus, hammered away at the shutter, and we got this interaction between the two cockatoos. And I really do like it. I know there's not a lot of color here. We get a little bit in that crest, but the background's interesting, the behavior's interesting. I did end up cropping this quite heavily because I was just unsure about the two stumps either side. Wasn't sure whether to include them or to remove them. So let me know in the comments if you like it with the stumps or without the stumps. But that was a highlight of the morning, that's for sure. Now, because we've got that wide field of view, you can use this for landscapes. I don't think many people are going to use it as a landscape lens, but you have that opportunity. I'm very fortunate to live on a hill, and I have a beautiful view of the mountains. And believe it or not, in winter in Australia, we do get snow. And here's a shot from my house. Is this beautiful mountain range. We've got a little bit of snow on the mountains. We've got some interesting light. And I shot that handheld 300 2.8, I think it was. So it goes to show that you can even use this for nice landscape shots. And the last shot I took with this lens that I want to share is just the scarlet robin female. I've shared her a lot recently, but here she is, nice and wide, 300mm. The bird's quite small, but she sits nicely in this rocky environment, shows her habitat, and again, very happy with how that shot turned out. All right, so now let's look at the photos I was able to get with the 1.4 converter. We're obviously now at 140 to 420 f4. I actually quite like this focal range. It's still fast at f4, but 420 just gives us that little bit of extra reach that we so desire with small subjects. When it was a little bit overcast, I've got fairy wrens that are jumping around in my front yard. The little male is the blue, who's just beautiful. You can see in this footage how quickly these birds move around, and shows how well the AF actually works, which I'll talk about later. Tracking the bird as it's jumping around, managed to fire off some frames just as the bird was jumping, and I'm happy to see that the head was sharp, but we've got a little bit of motion blur in the feet, which just shows the sort of how these birds move around. And I actually really like this shot, how it just captures that scene, I guess, how it captures that behavior, which is what we're after. So that was really, really cool. Sticking with the fairy wren, I've planted a number of native trees in my garden, and he was jumping around throughout these trees. And again, I've just held it up, taken some shots, and I like how that f4 just blurs that background, but we still get a sense of habitat. The bird is super sharp, no issues whatsoever, just look fantastic. And whilst photographing that fairy wren, I noticed a eastern spinebill, which is a honeyeater. It's got a long bill, very similar to a hummingbird, and I was feeding on one of our native grevilleas, and it's moving around a lot, and it's quite hard to position and find the bird. But thankfully, I got one opportunity as it started to feed on a flower. Autofocus has gone to the eye, we've rattled it off, and managed to capture this photo. Overall, I didn't use it all that much with the 1.4, but I was extremely happy with how it performed. These 1.4s don't seem to impact image quality all that much. The autofocus was good. Next up was the 2x converter. And this is probably the thing most people are interested in. Having a 200-600 5.6 finally gives us Canon users a 200-600, albeit very expensive. So I was curious to see how that would look. So let's have a look at the images I was able to capture with the 2x. And the first shot was actually a flock of cockatoos. You might not be aware, but cockatoos are one of the most common species around here where I live. And there's massive flocks of them flying around, and they just happen to be flying through the sky. I actually wish I had less focal length with this shot, but we managed to get this photo of all the cockatoos flying in the sky. I just like the chaos of this. I like the yellow under the wings. I just like that you can look at it and try and find these individual birds and what's going on. So that was a great start to using that combo. The next bird I spotted was a kestrel on a fence, and again I had the camera next to me and I've picked it up as I was driving. I've slowed down, the window was down, I've photographed it on the fence as I was driving past. And there is probably a touch of motion blur here, but I did actually quite like the beautiful kestrel in this environment. A nice rusty old barbed wire, a little bit of habitat in that background. Overall, pretty happy to capture that. So next up is a flight shot. I did take a few flight shots with this combo and it performed pretty well, but this one sort of stood out. Unfortunately, it's probably one of Australia's ugliest birds. It's got a face only its mother could love, and that's the Australian white ibis, or often referred to as the bin chicken, due to its habit of going through the trash. This bird actually flew off. I've tracked it, and we just got a nice wing position, and when we zoom in, it's extremely sharp. So overall, the wing position and the sharpness worked out well and shows off the features of this unique looking Australian bird. Next up is a little thornbill, a yellow rump thornbill. These tiny little birds, I love hearing them in the bush. There's quite a few of them on my property and they just bounce around. They're always moving. They literally never stop. So trying to get photos of them is extremely difficult. But surprisingly, I was able to track this bird pretty well with the eye tracking, and it stopped momentarily, rattled off a number of shots, and we got this one. I quite like the inclusion of the habitat, the rocks. It just seems to work, and I was very happy to add that to my collection. So whilst driving down the road, I spotted a black-shouldered kite just hovering in the sky. I've quickly jumped out of the car, grabbed the camera, just taken some shots as it was hovering. I was actually a little bit far away and the sky was quite bright. I ended up getting a bit creative with this shot because the sky was white, but I think this black and white version does work. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think of it. I like it. And lastly, I went down to my local lake and we had some purple swamp hens. I just really like the color of the reeds in this shot. That's what attracted me to it. These birds are quite common and I like the pose, like the color, like the setting, just work. And I think this just showcases what's possible with that 200-600. And as you can see from all the images I captured, I had quite a lot of fun and added numerous images to my collection. However, I like to be honest with you. I left quite disappointed with the performance of the 2x converter, and I made a grave error, and this is all my fault. I should know better, but when we use 2x converters, ideally we should stop down the lens because it's often sharper stop down. However, I shot the majority of the time at 5.6, which is wide open. And unfortunately, the quality just is inconsistent. I had quite a few shots which just weren't critically sharp. They were just slightly soft when I expected them to be sharp. That kestrel, for example, when we zoom in, the detail's just not there. Again, that could be partially motion blur. And when we look at this black-shouldered kite, I had really hoped this image would be super sharp, but again, it's just slightly soft. It's just missed. And many of you asked me to use the R7 with this combo, and I did just that. I used the R7 with the 2x. Considering the focus shifting issues I'm having with the R7, it was just a disaster. I was shooting in really low light and my keeper rate was extremely poor. I did get a couple of keepers. This is probably the best of them, which came out all right, but this was the exception rather than the rule. So overall, I wish I'd realized earlier that I should have been shooting at say 7.1 or f8 to get that critical sharpness. Once I figured that out, and I did take a few shots at 7.1, we can see this Jackie Winter. It's quite sharp and it's very good, but I should have known better. And I guess it's just a warning. If you buy this combo, you're probably going to need to shoot at least 7.1, maybe even f8 to get the best sharpness out of it. But that was just my finding. Again, I shot in poor light, which didn't help matters. I didn't really have any really good light. The only good light I had, I photographed this feral. It was on the pond and we had reasonably nice light. The image looks fantastic, but when we zoom into 100%, it's just slightly off. It's not as sharp as I would hope for a lens of this price. And that leads me to the biggest question I got, and that is, how does this lens compare to the Sony 200-600? I've gone on about how good this lens is. People know how good it is. Considering the price, I think this Sony lens, well, it cost me just over 2,000 Australian. I think it's 2,000 US. 9,500 US. Add the extender, you're looking at 10,000 versus 2,000. Of course, this is a 600mm lens, so it's not a fair comparison. This is a 300mm lens, and you need to understand that. We're comparing a dedicated 600mm wildlife lens to a 300. The 2x converter is always going to impact the quality. Well, we shouldn't expect this to be sharper than this wide open. However, we need to do some tests just to ascertain if that is actually the case. Now, I need to be clear, these comparisons I make are not scientific at all. It's just me out in the bush on a tripod taking photos. There's chance of motion blur, there's chance that it's not accurate. You just need to understand that this is my anecdotal experience. This is what happened to me out in the field, shooting them exactly the same, in the same way. Now remember, the Canon R3 is 24 megapixels, 600 5.6. The Sony is the A7 IV, which is 33 megapixels, which is a slight advantage, 200 to 600, 6.3. So this is slightly faster, whereas this has slightly more megapixels. And as you can see, the first shot and the first comparison I can take is that the 5.6 definitely dissolves that background a little bit more. And the Sony is notorious for losing focal length as we get closer. And you can see here that the bird is actually smaller on the Sony. And you can see on that ruler that it's about 21 inches. That's how much is in the frame, whereas this is about 20 inches. So it just goes to show that slight difference there. However, when we zoom into 100%, that's when the Sony has an advantage because we've got more megapixels. And it becomes immediately obvious that the Sony is quite a bit sharper than the Canon wide open. And this is exacerbated when we go down to that ruler. There really is no comparison here. The Sony is much sharper. Again, this is possibly a depth of field issue. It could be slight motion blur, but I did take a couple of bursts and this was the best I got at 5.6 with the 2x in that environment. So as I mentioned, when we stop this down, it gets sharper. So I went to f8, and the first comparison is this lens at 5.6 versus f8. And it's night and day, the difference. Stop down is just so much sharper. We can look at the ruler. The stop down is just way better. Now, if we compare f8 to 6.3, we can see that they're very similar now. It's just way sharper. However, that's a bit of a concern that we have to stop this down to f8, whereas this one's sharp at 6.3. You kind of lose the advantage. And why have you got such a big heavy lens when you're shooting it at 7.1 or f8? I did shoot at 6.3 on this, but again, at 6.3, it still wasn't quite as sharp as the Sony. In terms of sharpness at 600, the Sony is going to win over this combination. Now you might be asking, well, what if we shoot with the R5, which has 45 megapixels? And again, I did that. I shot it wide open on the R5. For whatever reason, it was, I think, slightly sharper on the R5, which may indicate some user error. However, it was still a lot sharper on the Sony. Even though that Canon is much bigger because of the more megapixels, we can see that the Sony just has a clear sharpness advantage. Now, in terms of shots in the field, I did manage to have these two lenses side by side, and we had a scarlet robin land on the rock. So I've taken some shots with the R3, and then I've taken some shots with the Sony, trying to get them as similar as I could. And here's the result of the two side by side. When we look at the wide version, we can see again that the background's slightly more out of focus because of the 5.6. However, when we zoom in, again, the Sony's got that little bit of advantage over the size. So in terms of image quality on the Canon, I was actually pretty happy. It performed pretty well considering I was wide open. And to me, the Sony just looks slightly better in that comparison. This comparison clearly raises a lot of questions for me. This kit here cost me 5,000 Australian. This kit will cost me 25,000, so 5 times as much. Again, this is not a wildlife lens. I hate to compare the two. But if I just wanted a pure wildlife for birds, etc., this one obviously is just hands down going to produce much sharper shots than this one, which is a disappointment considering how many of you were very curious about the 2x performance. All right, so that's all well and good if we're a Sony shooter, but we're Canon shooters, so we can't use this lens. So it's of no value to us. So what can we do instead? Well, we can buy the Canon 100-500, which is significantly cheaper than this lens. It gives us 500mm. It is 7.1, which is obviously a little bit slower, and our backgrounds aren't going to be the same. But I was curious to see what the difference was in terms of the image quality. Now, I've decided to actually take some more tests in far better light, which would help with the performance of this combination. So we put Gary the Glar in the light, and I've actually shot this at 500mm and 5.6, so 500 wide open compared to 500 7.1. And again, when we look at the wide version, you can see that the background just looks much better on the 5.6 because of that shallower depth of field. However, when we zoom in, again, we can see that this lens, wide open, just outperforms this one. It's quite sharp. 7.1, this lens is very sharp, and I was very impressed with the image quality that we're getting from this. However, as soon as we go to 600mm 5.6, it starts to show the difference in that focal length. We can see the wide version, 600 5.6, is just, the subject's much, much bigger. That background is way more out of focus. And when we zoom in, this one actually performs pretty well, remarkably, in that nice light. Drop this one down to 7.1, and you're going to probably have a very equivalent or similar image to this one. Obviously, this is much heavier and more expensive to this one, and it just goes to show what a good little performer this lens is. And the last lens, I know there's a lot of comparisons here, but many of you asked me to do it. The last comparison I wanted to make was with my big 500 f4, this big monster, which is my primary lens at 500 f4. Now I use a 1.4 converter on that all the time. So I'm generally shooting at 700 5.6. And when we compare 700 5.6 to 600 5.6, the difference is pretty obvious. That big prime just blows this out of the water. And this is actually very sharp 5.6. You can see that up close. No issue whatsoever, hands down, a much sharper lens. So another question I got was around the R7 and how that compares. Now, as I mentioned, I struggled in the rainforest. However, I did take some tests in this comparison with the R7. And when we compare the R7 to the R3 on the 100-300 with the 2x, you can see just how much bigger that subject is. Remember, we're at 960mm field of view, so really, really big subject. And now when we zoom in, we're even going to have a bigger issue because this is 24 megapixels. The R7 is 32 megapixels. And again, the R7 is suffering a little bit from those sharpness issues that I've encountered. Unfortunately, I didn't shoot at f8 with the R7, but you just need to know with an APS-C sensor, you're going to get the subject much bigger in the frame. And if you stop this down, I suspect the R7 and this lens would make a wonderful combo, albeit very expensive. And one last thing about image quality, people ask me about sharpness and image quality all the time. Modern lenses are pretty much all sharp, and in good light, it's very hard to tell them apart. And for example, here's two shots side by side. One of them was taken with a kit worth 15,000 US. The other shot was taken with a kit that is secondhand around 650. So a huge difference between the two. When we look at the subject, they're both sharp, they're hard to distinguish. The dead giveaway is, of course, the background. The background of the expensive kit is just more out of focus. However, the more affordable kit performs very well. So what's my conclusion after doing all these comparisons and doing all these tests? Canon does not have a 600mm zoom that can compete with the Sony, the Nikon, the Fuji, the Tamron, or the Sigma. We have the 100-500, and this is an incredible lens. It's excellent, and I love it. Nobody else really competes with this lens. Canon's the only one. However, we do have a weakness in that 600mm range. It's sort of this 100-500, then the 600 f4. There's this void in the RF lineup between this beautiful zoom and those really expensive primes. And I would love to have something in between. So some of you are probably wondering, well, how does it perform without the 2x? And it performs extremely well. There is no issue with this lens whatsoever at 2.8, 300mm. It is extremely sharp. And even with the 1.4, very little loss of quality. And I shot this f4, super sharp. We got those fairy wrens, very, very happy. So the only issue for me was when I started using the 2x wide open. So apart from this, fantastic. So another common question I got was, how's the autofocus and the accuracy? And as you would expect, a lens of this value, the autofocus is blazingly fast. It's exceptional. It's got dual nano USM motors inside which drive the autofocus. Combine that with the speed of the R3, and it's one of the best autofocus systems I have used. And I took a little bit of viewfinder footage, and you can see how well it tracks the subject. Now what I did was, this is very basic, but I just went from the background to the subject, just by pushing AF on, and it automatically, almost instantly goes back and forward. And even when I put the lens completely out of focus, I hit AF on straight to that subject. So it's very, very fast. And you can kind of see when we compare it to the 400 5.6, it just takes that little bit longer to find the subject. It's just slightly slower, and you get this in the field as well. Even my 500 f4 isn't as fast as this is. You can notice that slowness in acquiring the focus. This one is just blazing fast. I know I've had a lot of focus shifting issues with the R7, and I kind of still did, but this R3 is just a different ballgame altogether. Believe it or not, I took a burst of 146 images, and they were all sharp. Every one of them, which is just phenomenal. And to test this, I actually had my dog walking with me in the morning, so I've just photographed the dog, and as you can see, as the dog's running towards me, it locks onto the eye. I'm shooting in high burst rate, and all these images are sharp. And when we zoom in, just great detail. I think I had the 1.4 on there, so I was shooting at f4, but again, you're not going to have an issue with the autofocus with this combo. It just works, and I don't really need to say any more about it, other than it's one of the best autofocus lenses I've used. At the start of the review, I did mention the image stabilization, and it is very good, but I have a tendency to shake quite a bit, and so I really struggle at slow shutter speeds. But I went for a walk, and I decided to dial in a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, which is very slow for me. I had a kangaroo and had a little Joey in its pouch, and I think I had a burst of around 50 shots at 1/50th handheld, and just over half of them were sharp, which is not a bad keeper rate, especially for me. And we can see that this image holds up pretty well. It's sharp. Love to have that little baby there. In terms of the IS for video, now I did struggle, I'll be honest, and you can see in this footage, handheld footage, there is a little bit of shake going on here, and that's just me trying to handhold video. We can get around that by having a higher frame rate, maybe 60p, and then you can stabilize and post, and you end up with footage like this, handheld, and it's definitely usable. One thing video shooters will like, very smooth going from 100 to 300. So if you shoot video, this is quite a nice lens to use. Now, the reason this lens is so big is obviously that 2.8 aperture. All that means is it lets in quite a bit of light for the length of the lens. And if you watch my recent video, if we use the window analogy, let's say we've got a 300 2.8 and we have a large window letting in light to light up the room. If I had a 300 f4, for example, f4 is one stop slower than 2.8, so our window would be half the size, and it's going to let in half the amount of light. So that ability means we can shoot at higher shutter speeds in low light or use lower ISO. And that is an enormous advantage, especially for sports shooters, etc. Canon have actually supplied these two images, which highlights that point. On the left, we have the 300 2.8. You can see the player is nice and sharp. It's frozen the action. We're at 1/2000th of a second. On the right-hand side, with the 100 to 500, we're at 300mm 5.6. Due to that 5.6 aperture, they've had to go down their shutter speed by 2 stops to 1/500th, which introduces some motion blur. So at the end of the day, this lens in that low light is just going to allow higher shutter speeds or lower ISO, and that's why it's so expensive. That's why it's so big, is because it just lets in all that extra light. The other big advantage of 2.8 is clearly the depth of field. 2.8 is extremely narrow, and if we look back to that Canon image, you can see that the 2.8 image on the left, that background is out of focus, it's blurry, whereas the 5.6 on the right, it's a lot more in focus. This is just a lot more pleasing if you want to sort of blur out that background. And of course, the limiting factor here is how close you are to that subject. The closer you get to your subject, the more out of focus that background's going to become. So the next topic I want to cover is the minimum focus distance. That's how close we can get to the subject and still maintain autofocus. This lens has improved slightly on its predecessor. This is 1800mm versus the 2000mm of the previous one, but that is still not all that good if you compare it to, say, the 100 to 500. Now, they do release the maximum magnification of these lenses, and I've actually created this chart that you can see. The higher the number, the more magnification we get. So this lens on its own is 0.16. When we start using converters on this, then we get quite a bit more magnification, as you would expect. So it now climbs to a magnification of 0.31, which is actually good, and it puts it ahead of the Sony and the other 600mm zooms. So in that regard, you can definitely get very close to the subject with the 2x attached. I didn't actually take too many shots up close. All I got really was this flower, and you can see the detail on this flower is exceptional, as you would expect. Okay, so let's summarize. If you've made it this far, thank you very much. But in the end of the day, this lens is simply fantastic. As a 300 2.8, full credit to Canon. This is just a bit of an engineering masterpiece to have 100 to 300 that's so sharp. The AF is super fast. We've got the inclusion of that preset button. It feels great in the hand, great weather sealing. The overall quality is exceptional, as you would expect for that price. It's ideal for sport shooters or people who shoot large mammals and need to photograph in low light. However, when we start using converters, we start compromising on that image quality, and the value proposition definitely decreases. The fact you've got to stop this down to say 7.1 or f8 with a 2x makes it a very heavy 200 to 600 lens, and there's just obviously better options out there. For my Australian conditions, if I had to choose between this lens and the 100 to 500 for birding, I would be going with the 100 to 500. The fact that it's sharp, wide open at 7.1, the fact we have 100 to 500 in the one lens, the fact that it weighs half, the fact that it's significantly cheaper, it's about a third the price. I just think this offers far more value for money, and is definitely the lens I would be reaching for. Overall, I had a lot of fun with this lens. I know I've been slightly negative due to my experience with the 2x. However, as an actual 300 2.8, it is fantastic. And to be fair, I shot in pretty poor conditions and I only had the lens for 4 or 5 days. So I suspect if you had it long term and you went to some better environments and better places, you'd have a lot more success than I had. And again, perhaps just stopping down would have drastically improved my results with that 2x. But as it stands, for small birds and wildlife, I just don't see this as a worthwhile investment unless you have the funds, of course. I'd just be waiting for that 200 to 500. I hope you enjoyed this video. Obviously give it a thumbs up if you did. If you want to become a member and directly support the channel, I would be extremely grateful for that. So the cost of less than a coffee per month, you can join the channel. You get a cool little bird emoji next to your name. If you visit the comment section and you see all those little birds next to people, they are existing members. So thank you very much. You also get access to the 2023 digital calendar. Even though we're halfway through the year, there's still 6 months left for you to enjoy. So obviously appreciate your time. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, happy birding. Take care. See you later.